Samoa's Deputy Prime Minister says Australia has taken a patronising approach to Samoa over its relationship with China. Fiame Naomi Matafafa says sat down with Foreign Affairs reporter Stephen Jedgetts to discuss the Australian government's Pacific Step Up program.
Well, Deputy Prime Minister, thanks very much for joining the ABC. We appreciate your time. Now, let's talk a little bit about the Pacific Step Up that the Australian government is pursuing. This is a pretty ambitious agenda here from Canberra. What do you think is driving Australia's desire to engage more intensively in the region?
I think the global political situation and how Australia is viewed from that global perspective, being the larger country in the region, I think it's been asked to play a particular role.
And who do you think's asking us to play that role? Do you think that the US, for example, is asking Australia to step up in something that has perhaps rather patronisingly been regarded by Australian officials as its patch for some time?
Yes, I think so. I mean, that's nothing new. I think that has been the arrangement for quite a long time now. But I think, you know, the rise of China and its Belt and Road initiatives is creating, you know, some new dynamic in the global picture.
Now, when it comes to China, in your speech this morning, you accused Australia of taking a slightly patronising attitude towards Samoa's relationship with China. Can you expand on that? In what way has Australia been patronising?
Well, you know, it's in the discourse of, you know, essentially we're being cautioned, we're being warned, we are being told that perhaps we're not fully nuanced on the intentions, I suppose, would be one of the ways of putting it, of the relationship with China. But you know, Stephen, we've had relations with China since 1975, so it's not a new relationship. And in terms of our development partners, China and to some extent also Japan, or largely Japan, they have been the donor that we've worked with to support especially infrastructure projects. And that's been, you know, in the works for a very long time, not just more recently.
So, in your view then, Samoa is fully capable of dealing with China. What do you regard then of these warnings that are sometimes put about by Australian officials and more often by American officials about China's ambitions for debt-trap diplomacy in the region? Do you believe that those claims are a little overinflated? It's
part of the lot of governments, you know, whether they be small ones or big ones, that they ultimately make the decisions for the good of their respective countries. Now, I think it's a bit unfair in that it's not as though Australia or even the United States don't have relations with China. In fact, they have huge relationships with China, especially on the trading side. So, in some ways, you know, from the way we look at it, it would suggest that it's all right for them to have relations, but then for us, we need to, you know, take the advice from someone else on how we conduct our relationships with other countries. All right, let's talk, Deputy Prime Minister, a little bit about climate change. A large number of Pacific leaders have been quite critical of Australia's climate policies. Do you believe, does the government of Samoa believe, that Australia's step up in the Pacific is being undermined by its climate change policies? Well, I think it does, in the extent that climate change is the issue that has not only brought the Pacific together, but it's also brought the globe together. And, you know, of note, the New Zealand government under the Labour government has made that significant shift in terms of its climate change policy, and now that it's set a goal for 2050 to be carbon neutral. And, you know, Australia is part of our region, and it feels like, you know, it's so important if we're looking at this issue globally that all of us in the Pacific can be aligned in this global effort.
Australia, though, points out it pours an enormous amount of money, far more than any other country, into climate change adaptation measures across the Pacific. Does Australia get fair credit for the work that it's doing in that regard to try and mitigate some of the impacts of climate change?
Well, you know, mitigation is important, and we do appreciate the contributions that Australia makes. But that does not in any way, I think, for any reasonable and intelligent people, you know, it doesn't offer an excuse not to get on board the climate change agenda.
Deputy Prime Minister, I might just pick up on something you said in your speech, which was curious. You said on the question of identity that it's fundamentally important for individual countries to have a discussion about who we are. You said that Australia, respectfully, hadn't yet finalised that discussion, and that was a bit of an inhibiting factor when it comes to its relationship with the Pacific. Can you expand a bit on what you meant there? Are you referring to Australia's relationship with its own Indigenous history, its Indigenous people? Does that have an impact on the Pacific step-up and Australian Pacific policy, or how Australia is perceived in the region?
Well, I think the main point of my address this morning, you know, was the collective, because that's the basis from which my leadership is drawn from. And, you know, if Australia is part of the Pacific collective, then I think it needs to, you know, see itself as that. And I don't think it does. I think Australia is still very connected, and understandably, historically, say, to the UK, politically, perhaps to the US. But, you know, you've had these discussions in Australia, not so much perhaps with its Pacific identity. And I think the point I was trying to make, Stephen, is that, you know, we claim Australia as part of our collective from the Pacific, and we would really like to see Australia see itself in that light.
Deputy Prime Minister, thanks very much for joining the ABC. We appreciate you giving us your time.
Thank you.